Detroit, you've touched my soul. Thanks for the memories I cherish so. Winter, spring, summer, and fall, you've got it all. Hello, hello, hello. Hello, Detroit.
It's going to be a black mark in a lot of people's eyes. I don't think it's more widespread. Every organization has got problems. You have your bad apples, you get rid of them, and you're that much better off. End quote. This comment was by Police Chief Stanley Knox in response to one of the many police scandals that racked the Detroit Police Department throughout the 1980s and 1990s. How did the department, continuously lit with controversies, condense these offenses to just a few small figures making bad decisions and not something larger? This point of view isn't solely held by those higher up in the department, but can be seen in its officers and public officials in the aftermath of allegations of misconduct and corruption. These opinions can influence the structure of and behavior of the department. To better understand this, we must first understand the state of Detroit and the history of the police department within it. The Detroit Police Department, even before it ran under the city's first black mayor, Coleman Young, was not unmarked in the eyes of the public. Police misconduct and brutality towards its citizens were not out of the norm between the 1950s and 60s, specifically towards its black citizens. The city's black population felt that mostly white officers policing their neighborhoods were both neglectful and harmful to them. In a 15-city survey post-riot, 60% of black Detroiters felt that the police weren't timely in their responses from predominantly black neighborhoods. Between May 1961 and February 1964, 1,041 instances of force were used against citizens by the DPD, 617 of which were black. This treatment infuriated its citizens to the point where in late July of 1967, a civil disturbance starting at 3:45 a.m. July 23rd stretched until July 29th, resulting in 43 deaths, nearly 1,200 injuries, and over 7,000 arrests. The after effect of the uprising was an even more fragile relationship between the DPD and its citizens, which the force only responded to by putting even more radical policies in place. There was an effort to turn the DPD around in the 1970s, but unfortunately, this turnaround resulted in a police department with even more inappropriate policies. Come 1974, Detroit's first black mayor, Coleman A. Young, was adamant about changing the department, firing Commissioner Nichols, and dismantling the controversial stress unit established 3 years prior. Young faced an uphill battle during his formative years as mayor because of how resistant the DPD was to change. A focal point of Young's 1973 campaign was reforming the DPD, mainly through affirmative action, which the predominantly white Detroit police force wasn't keen on, and even made claims of reverse discrimination. This did not deter the mayor, since he still dismantled stress within the first 6 months of his career, and the number of black officers increased from 18.7% in 1974 to 35.6% at the end of his first term. It can be said that the racial climate of the city at the time and the Detroit Police Department's feelings towards the mayor could have played a role in why corruption behaved the way it did. The mayor would achieve his goals, but did not eliminate all the problems present, specifically those involving corruption. Due to misconduct and corruption not being wholly rooted out, the Detroit Police Department would attract the attention of larger outside forces who felt that an investigation into the force was necessary. One of these scandals was in the case of the murder of 13-year-old Damian Lucas. The young boy was killed in a drive-by shooting on April 29, 1985, targeting his uncle Leon. This case acted as a catalyst for what would become the infamous undercover investigation Operation Backbone. The boy's uncles owed money to notorious Detroit drug dealer Leo Curry, half of the Curry brothers, for selling the game fraudulent boxing game tickets. Despite the apparent connection, the DPD chose to arrest Lakeith Davis, a man who Leon was seen with earlier in a dispute. This surprised the FBI and raised particular flags with Agent Herman Groman. While investigating the Curry brothers, Groman discovered that Johnny Curry had called Mayor Coleman Young's head of security and police sergeant James Jimmy Harris and the former head of the Detroit Police Homicide Department, Gil Hill, the morning after the shooting. With the apparent connection being ignored by the DPD and the relationship between Harris, Hill, and Curry coming to light, Groman took the evidence to Davis's lawyer to free the man. Still, the agent was hell-bent by this point on exposing the high-level corruption he suspected was present in the Detroit Police Department. Agent Herman Groman already had suspicions stemming from the Damian Lucas case and a critical link between a supposed leak in the DPD and narcotics.
He believed that the Detroit cops that investigated homicide were protecting
Sergeant
drug dealers.
James Jimmy Harris was found to have a connection with the Curry brothers along with Gil Hill following the shooting. Surprisingly, this wasn't the officer's first scandal in his career, since Harris was a member of the controversial police division Stress. In 1972, the officer was charged with assault and intent to kill because of his role in the Rochester Street Massacre, a shootout between Wayne County deputies and Stress members that resulted in the death of one and paralysis of another. Despite this, the jury found him and two other officers not guilty, and in the aftermath of the acquittal, Wayne County prosecutor William L. Callahan explained that no new charges were necessary. With this, Harris's role in the DPD was still secured. The investigation didn't stop at the connection between Curry and Harris, but spiraled into a year-long undercover investigation. Using Rick Wersch Jr., White Boy Rick, as an informant for the FBI, the young man introduced secret agent Michael Castro, who was playing a Miami drug dealer, to Johnny Curry's wife, Kathy Volsan Curry. Kathy Volsan Curry is Mayor Coleman Young's niece, and many assume that is partially why the investigation extended the way it did, in an effort to dig up dirt on the mayor.
Tried to get me to tell about police corruption, wanted to know all of the things that I did for Mayor Young.
Volsan fell for the setup and ultimately introduced Castro to her father, William Volsan, who linked with Sergeant Jimmy Harris and other DPD officers to secure drug money through the Detroit Metro Airport to banks. 4 operations were completed with the support of these officers, who were paid upwards of $3,000 for their work. Taking the case a step further, under the alias of Mike Diaz, Castro invited Jimmy Harris and William Volsan onto a yacht in Miami with a hidden camera to discuss moving kilos of cocaine into Detroit for a total of $50,000.
We're in the drug business. You can give us a heads up on any police that are in the area. Okay. Number 1.
Okay.
And number 2. So we got a deal?
Yeah.
The results of this secret project were the arrest of 11 cops and 5 civilians, including Jimmy Harris, William, and Kathy Volsan. This revealed case was another hit to the department and Young administration. This case saw a lot of coverage and was widely publicized because of how high up it went with its connection to the mayor's personal relationships. The case reached far, so immediate responses in the aftermath varied. The quote at the top of this video was by none other than Chief of Police Stanley Knox in response to Operation Backbone becoming known to the public. Knox essentially explained that Sergeant Jimmy Harris and other officers involved were bad apples, and that the department would be better off without them. In another comment concerning the incident, the chief doubled down when he said, "This is a sad day. What can you do? It's only a few people, but it's going to hurt everybody." End quote. Knox's questionable observations weren't just reserved for this case either, since during the arrest and subsequent indictment of his predecessor, former Chief of Police William Hart, also at the hands of the FBI for stealing $2.6 million from the DPD, he made comments practically in defense of the man. Knox told the Detroit Free Press almost a year after his comments on Operation Backbone that he was shocked, surprised, like everyone else. "I've known him a long time. I don't think he's that kind of person," about Chief Hart's conviction. This thinking style isn't exclusive to the chief or the department. The Detroit police officers and their accessible comments haven't differed much from that of their chief regarding cases like these. They also speak in defense of the men or diminish the damage to their department. Retired homicide detective Danny Knepp commented on the arrest of Lionel Dickens, another officer arrested in the FBI sting, and James Harris. All I can tell you is that they were two good cops. Hell, I worked for years with both of them. I'd go out with either of them right now, end quote. Another downtown officer said this about Hart during his trial. Bill Hart was good to me, and Bill Hart was a good guy. I think Bill Hart got caught up in something he had no control over, end quote. These two quotes may seem as if they are simply speaking in regard to these men's characters, but considering the wording, it's concerning to hear officers speak like this in response to the arrest of alleged corruption. One comment asserts that they were good cops, despite being charged with breaking the very same laws they were meant to enforce, and would still have close enough relationships with them to hang out. The officer takes any accountability away from Hart by saying that he was involved in something he had no control over as his trial began. However, it was never discussed, even in the early stages, that Hart acted at someone else's discretion, so his actions shouldn't have been minimized or shifted elsewhere as this officer attempted. These assertions by those working for the Detroit Police Department aren't that different from other public officials at the time, even in the local government. After the arrest of those caught in Operation Backbone, Councilman Clyde Cleveland said, "I hope the citizens of this city do not feel that the whole department is dirty. The police department is made of honest, decent, and dedicated officers," end quote. This is another one of those comments meant to separate the bad apples away from the department in an effort to save face. This is, of course, only a few figures and their thoughts on the arrest of their peers and employees, but there is an obvious pattern in their opinions on the subject. These statements can be used to explain how the DPD most likely protected corruption instead of eliminating it. This isn't just a DPD problem, but an issue of the culture instilled in the police force. It is first essential to note the learned culture in police departments like the DPD. Lanzu Kadus in Chapel found an emphasis on lessons upholding the structure and culture of the police and academies. One of the themes they noticed was the teaching of solidarity and loyalty among the officers. Thomas Schneider, president of the Detroit Police Officers Association, explained, "Chief Hart was a friend to many of our members, and they and others are saddened that his career has to end in this fashion," end quote. This is an example of how loyal they are to each other and how tight-knit this department is. This system of loyalty is a critical component of police culture and is responsible for the creation of the code of silence among them.
Afraid that one of your fellow officers might turn you in? Never. Why not? Because it was the blue wall of silence. Cops don't tell on cops.
Officers develop an us versus them mentality regarding the public they serve to the point where they are increasingly secretive about their work. During his time serving, Chief William Hart was adamant that the public shouldn't know too much about police work because it was above their understanding. A Detroit Free Press editorial noted that, after years of brazenly insisting that the public had no business knowing too much about police operations, William Hart is now on trial for corruption charges, end quote. Hart was also fiercely loyal to Mayor Young and mentioned, "All you have to do to stay police chief is to have the mayor behind you, and he'll be there as long as you're loyal. I'm his employee. I answer to him and no one else," end quote. The secrecy was apparent enough that Detroiters picked up on it, and it can be said that this lack of transparency and emphasis on hierarchy allowed the chief to embezzle the millions that he did. To further understand police culture, Michael Caldero in Police Ethics, The Corruption of Noble Causes, describes it in the form of an onion, meaning that it has layers. Layer 1 is standard cop work, protecting citizens and arresting criminals. The second was uncertainty about protecting themselves. In this context, the third and most relevant layer is their solidarity with their fellow officers. They gain this solidarity from the isolation they feel in their profession, giving them a strong shared identity instilled in officers through their training. Marilyn Corsianos in The Complexities of Police Corruption, Gender, Identity, and Misconduct explained that the perceived probability of dangerous instances promotes sense of solidarity intersected with an understanding of police work, where officers must protect and support each other, end quote.
Regardless if he's white or black, I like working with him. He's a police officer just like I am. We wear the same colors, blue. I spend just as much time with my partner than I do my wife. In fact, I probably spend more.
It's a family relationship. It's a marriage, and my life depends on him, and his life depends.
Retired Detroit police officers Fred Williams explained to the Detroit News in 1991 that cops tend to socialize with other cops. They tend to get myopic, end quote.
We were first married. I didn't understand the closeness of the family of the police department. And I was real jealous. Real jealous that he would spend time with them when it was my night off or something. And it's, they have to have that.
This means that cops are aware that when they are so closely associated with one another, they become narrow-minded in their thinking and victims of a hive mind. A consequence of this mentality is that it can create a culture where corruption and misconduct are protected instead of criticized. The fourth layer is officers protecting themselves from external oversight, which some claims interferes with their work. This layer is one that the DPD has commonly exhibited because of their reluctance to accept outside investigations or help. Farmington Hills Police Chief Dwyer, a former DPD officer, said, "Before I left the department, we were plainly instructed not to offer assistance to federal authorities," end quote. Dwyer further explained that federal agents would have trouble getting backup or information. Law enforcement agents had also felt that there was a lack of trust and cooperation, leading to them losing suspects because they couldn't get the necessary resources in times of collaboration. It's also important to note that the Detroit Police Department is an organization that in 1991 had an astounding budget of over $300 million, and the goal of any organization is survival. This means that at the top, the job of those higher up is to protect the organization and guarantee its survival. This is why we have comments by Stanley Knox, William Hart, and Mayor Young, all essentially saying that it's not an organizational problem, but just a few bad apples. These are the people at the top of the hierarchy, and the problem with them downplaying these instances of corruption in favor of self-preservation is that it sets a precedence for what is allowed. Weisberg and Greenspan discovered that 85% of officers surveyed agreed or strongly agreed that a police chief's strong position against the abuse of authority can make a big difference in deterring officers from abusing their authority. A retired officer, Isaiah McKinnon, explained that when he was a rookie cop, "I've always respected and worked well with Bill Hart. As a young police officer coming on the job, I worked with him and he was someone I looked up to. He gave me guidance and inspiration," end quote. This quote explains these administrative leaders' impact on their officers and how much they follow them. McKinnon still said this even in the aftermath of the chief's indictment. The rotten apple metaphor used by Chief Knox is an example of those higher up in the DPD veiling the severity of corruption and not using their authority to come down harder on it. The Knapp Commission noted that the rotten apple doctrine has been a basic obstacle to meaningful reform, end quote. Corsianos also mentioned that by avoiding or minimizing discussions regarding the incident with peers and rather centering communication on the media, representations, and the public reaction, a culture of tolerance for this behavior is preserved, end quote. When asked if the department was out of control after reports of police misconduct, Hart said, "I don't think the public had that perception. That's the perception of the media, not the public," end quote. This comment is the chief wanting to separate the incident from the public and get in the genuine concerns of the public and shift it towards media reactions as if the media fabricated claims of corruption. It is significantly worse in the case of police chiefs and their mayors protecting corrupt officers. The FBI sting and Hart indictment were complicated for the mayor since three key figures had a connection to him, being his appointed chief of police, niece, brother-in-law, and former security guard. Young was never formally charged in either of these instances, but there were allegations that the man had a connection to the money stolen by Chief Hart. Kenneth Weiner, who was Chief Hart's partner in the embezzling scheme, explained that more than $400,000 of the money was spent on buying lavish gifts for Mayor Young, but this had no significant impact on the case. It was also officially uncovered in the case that of the $300,000 traced to police operations, some of it was for dubious expenses like to guard Young's relatives full-time.
But $160,000 went to armor plate the mayor's 2 limousines. $17,000 bought Uzis and semi-automatic pistols for his bodyguards. Another $130,000 paid for security at Young's mansion.
Young broke his silence on the case a month after the arrest in Operation Backbone and said, "Do we reinstate them? What if they are found not guilty? Their reputations have been besmirched. It is irresponsible on the part of the federal government." End quote. It makes sense that the mayor would want to protect his favorite niece, but he had similar thoughts when Police Chief Hart, who he instated, was also arrested. In a 1991 press release, in which he announced the hiring of the new Chief of Police, Stanley Knox, he explained that an indictment is not a conviction. They resulted from a sting operation that was a de facto entrapment, and the chief got caught in a net. End quote. This is similar to the earlier comments that attempted to mitigate the damage by directing it elsewhere and taking the blame away from the perpetrators. The mayor even went as far as to assure that the chief still received pay when suspended in light of his indictment. The mayor, throughout these incidents, may have been placed in an impasse due to Hart being an official he appointed and the mayor being a politician above all else. Addressing police corruption as a mayor is difficult because there are certain aspects that one must have to tackle the subject properly. B.L. Garmeyer in Local Government Police Management explains that to handle police corruption, a police chief must have the power to implement wholesale reforms and must have political as well as administrative skills. End quote. William Hart wouldn't have been able to do any of these because he was the one indicted for corruption, but we can apply these same principles to Mayor Young since he was also in a position to influence change. Young was an effective enough leader to have won 5 mayoral elections, despite the troubles of each of his tenure and pushed back by white Detroiters in suburbs who felt the man was racist. Young still managed to be reelected by decently large margins. Garmeyer also said that they should have the media or local officials on their side, which Mayor Young often did not. Garmeyer explained that these reforms to rid the Department of corruption could include speaking out and ensuring authority is held accountable or improving internal affairs. Mayor Young did not allow Hart or those arrested in Operation Backbone to take accountability because of his relation to them and the need to preserve his political career. It's especially telling that Young had just faced re-election during the investigation into Hart. Detroit News columnist Pete Waldmere explained that the fact is that on November 7th, Young was re-elected to a record 5th 4-year term, so he can afford to stand behind Hart, right or wrong. The more pressure that's applied, the more facts that are presented, the harder the Young team works to discredit the accusers. End quote. This means that Young's term during the Hart and Operation Backbone corruption cases was already somewhat secured for at least 2 to 4 years, and the man still willfully chose to condemn them in both cases. This isn't to say that coming forward and admitting that something went wrong with his appointee or niece isn't damaging to one's political career, but the impact of not is just as damaging to the Detroit police force and the public which they serve. In this environment where the leaders and administration aren't condemning corruption and those responsible, their subordinates won't either. By willfully denying the existence of corruption on all levels, the DPD has undermined their officers' confidence in their department. After the trial began, one Detroit patrol officer explained, "Morale already was low. This was just another blow to your self-esteem and to how people think of you." End quote. With the department already subscribed to a specific culture with a hive mind and a strong sense of oneness, if the consensus held by those higher up doesn't denounce agency corruption, the trickle down will be an environment primed for corruption and no accountability. We saw this in the case of the responses by the DPD in the disclosure of the publicized corruption case Operation Backbone, and even regarding the indictment of former Chief of Police William Hart. The comments presented are habitual ones made not long after the scandals came to light, so they don't account for feelings further down the line. Still, I argue these immediate reactions are even more relevant because they expose authentic thinking patterns without being bogged down by backlash or their peers' consensus. When it came to condemning corruption, it was not commonly done by those higher up like the mayor, chief of police, officers, and council members who only sought to minimize backlash or to protect their peers and careers. Standing idly by in favor of preserving political power has made officials like Mayor Young complicit in protecting corruption in the DPD. Officers have been inflicted with these same habits of placing livelihood over civic duty. Although Detroit and the police department were brutalized with racism, there is little doubt that the environment present contributed to these cases of corruption. It is not a case of bad apples, but rotten orchards producing rotten barrels. This system of police corrupt culture in Detroit and the scarceness of accountability resulted in an environment that allowed corruption to thrive. We must take notice of this culture to understand better how to ward off law enforcement corruption by recognizing the causes.